I'm Scott Dodge. I'm a native of Utah, born and raised in Ogden. I currently live in Bountiful. I'm married, raising a family, and I'm a permanent deacon of the Roman Catholic Church, assigned to the Cathedral of the Madeleine here in Salt Lake City. I was born and raised in Ogden and moved to Salt Lake to attend the University of Utah in the late 80s. And I live in Bountiful, but I'm assigned here, and I've been at the cathedral for even since before I was ordained a deacon. But I've been here as a deacon for the past about 9.5 years. I think one of the unique things about being a Catholic in Utah, as opposed to many other places, is that religion in Utah is not a topic that people tend to avoid. And I know in working with a lot of people here in the parish who aren't from Utah, that that's an adjustment that they have to make. But even for a lot of people that have come here professionally or for academic reasons, they'll always say, I'm a better Catholic for having lived here even for a few years, because, having to explain my faith to people, understand it better myself. And so I think that is a very unique feature of being Catholic in Utah, but one that on the whole I think is really quite positive.
Que Dios Todopoderoso nos purifique del pecado y por la celebración de esta Santa Misa nos haga dignos de participar del banquete eterno de su reino.
The early to mid-90s, I think we estimated that the number of Catholics in Utah was somewhere around 80,000. But since that time, we're over 200. We're somewhere between 200 and 250,000 Catholics throughout the state. One of the things that's been interesting over the past 10 or 15 years is there are some places in the state where the Catholic community has always been really small. I think particularly of eastern Utah, but over that last decade or so, the Catholic population in those areas have begun to increase. We've only established one new parish in the past 10 years, but we've built 5 new churches for existing parishes to accommodate the growing number of people. For a long time, the Catholics have been, apart from the LDS, the largest single denomination in the state. We actually have a very large number of adult converts to the faith every year. Usually they're brought into the church at the Easter Vigil, and I think, pretty routinely, we have somewhere between 400 and 600 adults who become Catholic every year. And so I think in terms of, from that perspective, it's received very well. But at the same time, the Catholic Church is very committed to ecumenism, to interfaith matters. We run the Good Samaritan program, which is our parish outreach to the homeless. And the biggest single in-kind contributor to that is the LDS Church. And so, we do look for areas of common interest where we can make common cause for the wider community. And so in terms of both other faiths, but as well as in terms of just basically being a part of the community, I think the Catholic Church is received here very well. One of the biggest fundraisers that we have for the cathedral every year is called the Bishop's Dinner. And basically that's a big gala that we have to raise funds for the Cathedral Foundation. Because as beautiful as these old buildings are, it takes a lot to keep them up. And not this past year in 2012, but in 2011, we were getting ready to begin. And I was walking down the hall, and both Elder Ballard and Elder Nelson, who were attending, were sort of lost. And so, they saw me, we recognized each other and said, hey, follow me. And so there are a lot of really good stories like that of acceptance. I know our previous bishop, George Niederauer, who went on to become the Archbishop of San Francisco and then who just retired this past summer, He actually was called upon to do a lot of speaking at a lot of LDS functions, which he was always very eager and happy to do, both about interfaith matters, but also, about the history of Catholic LDS relations here. And then, just across the street, we have First Presbyterian Church, and with Mike Imperial, who is the pastor there, we really have a long, good relationship with them. And then with St. Mark's Cathedral, particularly with their previous rector, Father Rick Lawson, is a very good friend and actually a benefactor of the cathedral and of the cathedral choir school. So there's lots of good news across all of those fronts. Even as Catholics, we see this as not just being our church. That this is something that's kind of a vital place in the community for everyone. I think as you move away from something that's as predominant as the cathedral, probably in a lot of communities, even here throughout Salt Lake Valley, you probably don't have as much of an awareness of the presence of the Catholic Church. But as the church grows, that becomes more and more the case. But on the whole, I think the Catholic community has a fairly high profile. In addition to the cathedral in Draper, we have the Skaggs Catholic Center with St. John the Baptist Parish, Juan Diego High School, which is the biggest Catholic school campus in the United States. And that tends to be, apart from the cathedral, sort of another center of gravity for the diocese. Probably one of the most distinctive features of Catholic identity was not eating meat on Friday abstinence. And formerly, that was an obligation, i.e., we ate meat on Fridays on pain of sin, which meant that, if I had a cheeseburger on a Friday, I needed to mention that in confession before I went to Mass and received communion on Sunday. Very wisely, the fathers of Vatican II said, well, that just becomes a rule, it becomes a box that somebody checks. And then people even lose the whole thread as, why did we ever start doing this in the first place? And of course, Fridays are historically a penitential day because Jesus was crucified on a Friday. And abstaining from the meat of warm-blooded animals, going all the way back to the ancient church, has been one way of observing that. But it's kind of like a lot of things it wasn't the intention of the Council Fathers to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so they said, well, it's no longer obligatory, and it was left up to the individual bishops' conferences of different countries to determine how people where they were would observe Fridays as a day of penance. And the Catholic Bishop of the United States actually said still the normative way for doing that is to abstain from meat on Fridays, but it's not on pain of sin. And then if you choose not to abstain from meat, then it was an act of charity, which meant, doing something nice for someone that made you go significantly out of your way. So those are still there. And actually, with the younger generation of Catholics, those kind of practices are sort of making a profound comeback. We're starting to realize the renewal of people saying, I know why I do this, and it's something that I choose to do freely, and that's what gives it value for me. Well, the Mass, of course, is the center of what we do. Again, going back to the Second Vatican Council, the Council Fathers talked about the Mass as being the source and summit of our faith. I joke with people that, the importance of the Mass because even when we have Catholic Lagoon Day, we start out with a Mass at Lagoon, which is a good thing. But really the Mass in its structure is relatively simple. And even though we celebrate it in vernacular now, structurally, it's the same liturgy that the Church has celebrated throughout its entire history. And so if you break Mass up, there are what are called the introductory rites. There's always a procession going in, and then we begin Mass by making the sign of the cross and exchanging a greeting with the presider. And then we do either a penitential rite, or because this is Easter, we actually do a sprinkling rite where we sort of call to mind our baptism, and then the priest and the deacon walk through sprinkling everyone with holy water. And then on Sundays, we sing the Gloria, and then there's the opening collect or prayer. And then with the opening prayer, that's the ending of the introductory rites. And then we go into what's called the Liturgy of the Word. And during Sunday Mass, we have four readings from Scripture. Usually there's an Old Testament reading, but again, because it's Easter, our first reading is from the Acts of the Apostles. Then we have a responsorial psalm, which is sung. And and then a second reading, which is from one of the New Testament books, one of Paul's letters, or like today, from the book of Revelation, and then the gospel. And the gospel is proclaimed. If there's a deacon, it's the deacon's job to do that. In the absence of a deacon, it's the job of the priest to do that. And then there's a homily or a sermon. And that's one of the distinctive features of the Mass, is that the homily isn't the centerpiece. A homily typically will be somewhere between about 7 and 10 minutes. So it's relatively short. And then from there, there's the offertory, which is kind of a transitional point. Then we move to the liturgy of the Eucharist, where the Eucharistic prayer is said, and that concludes with the communion rite. That's when people come forward. And then there's the prayer after communion, and that brings the liturgy of the Eucharist to an end. And then after that, it is basically we go into the concluding rites, which ends with a dismissal. And the word Mass itself comes from the Latin word missa, meaning to be dismissed. So so the Mass is very connected with our lives. That it's not something we do for its own sake. That at the end of Mass we're sent forth. The hope that I would envisage for the Catholic Church in Utah is we really have experienced a period of very rapid growth. And I think in material terms, we've done a good job of keeping up with that, like in building churches that are adequately sized, really even in establishing schools. But I think our parishes are still, kind of under-resourced in terms of personnel. People to, not just pastorally guide and counsel, but people to teach. Because being a Christian is being a disciple of Christ, and that requires really a lifelong formation. But then at the same time, to continue being a very dynamic church. I know, I always tease with Bishop Wester, being a bishop's not an easy job, but I always say it's got to be better to be a bishop, in a place where the church is really dynamic and growing rather than the opposite, which is sadly the case in some places.